And my name is Frances Draper. I'm Vice Chancellor for Strategic Relations and Communications here at the university, and I'm delighted to be able to moderate this panel. I think the fun thing we have today is we actually have a balanced panel of conservative and liberal viewpoints, and it's perfect for this subject. So, and we'll see if everybody agrees with that statement or not. One of the things that we spend a lot of time working on is discussing what is free speech on campus. And the University of Colorado and its campuses, we have a very specific policy around free expression. And if you're interested in how the campus handles free speech, inviting speakers to campus, that sort of thing, we have a website that gives you all the tools. It's at colorado.edu/free-expression. And so that's designed for the campus, faculty, students, and community to be able to access and see how the place works. So we do have a goal of allowing students and faculty to invite speakers to the campus and making sure that those can be held on the campus and have civil discourse. And if people want to have other points of view being represented, they can also do that at the same time, or another time that's something that we do on a regular basis. So I'd like to introduce our panelists to you and then give them a few minutes to talk about their view on free speech on campuses. So I'm going to start with Dr. William Allen, who is currently our visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy, and he hails from Michigan State University and is a professor in political philosophy. He has served previously as a visiting scholar at Princeton University, and he is an expert in liberal arts education overall. So he has an interesting viewpoint and is familiar with campuses around the country and now very much with this campus. Our second panelist is Ian Milhiser, and Ian is a columnist with Think Progress. He clerked for Judge Eric Clay on the United States Court of Appeals in the Sixth Circuit. He served as a Teach for America Corps member in the Mississippi Delta, and he got his JD from Duke University, where he served as a senior note editor on the Duke Law Journal. He has authored a book called Injustices, the Supreme Court's History of Comforting the Comfortable and Afflicting the Afflicted.
Available wherever books are sold.
Yes, ready to sign that. Our third panelist is Professor Richard Collins, and he has spent 15 years practicing Indian law and has been involved in a number of significant cases in that area, working with the Native American Rights Fund. He's had a major role in many of the cases decided in the United States Supreme Court. He is also an expert and focuses on constitutional issues overall, and he was the director of the law school's Byron Wright R. White Center for the Study of American Constitutional Law from 2002 to 2010 here on the campus. And last but not least is a former one of the university's visiting scholars in conservative thought and policy, Dr. Robert Kaufman. He hails from Pepperdine University, and he is a political scientist specializing in American foreign policy. To give you an idea, he writes a lot of columns, so you may have seen him in a variety of places like Washington Times and the Weekly Standard Policy Review. And he has authored a number of books, and just to give you a taste of some of them, In Defense of the Bush Doctrine, and several other titles of the same ilk. So I think we've got a fairly balanced panel here today, and it should be a good discussion. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be able to be with you, which you may not believe when you discover that I'm going to have to leave you prematurely. But nevertheless, that is only because I'm hosting a concurrent event across campus that opens at 5:30. And it's very hard to be two places in the same time, though I have been known to try. So at all events, I'm pleased to join with this distinguished panel, and I apologize to them in particular for not being able to be here for the period of colloquy after our initial presentations, particularly since I've actually worked in all the fields they've worked in, and we'll be delighted to have the opportunity to exchange with them, including over federal Indian law. But free speech is all we can do today, and it's all I have time for. The panel is entitled The President's Latest Battleground, And the first observation I would make is that we haven't seen in a very long time a president who had or spoke to a battleground which wasn't already somebody else's battleground in this country, which is how those questions, of course, rise to the level of the desk of a president. So we're really talking about our battleground, not the president's battleground. If we weren't fighting over it, he wouldn't be speaking to it. Thus, the latest executive order dealing with the question of free speech on campus is a reflection of what's going on among us, not a reflection of what the president is predisposed to consider. And I want to emphasize that, for my position is somewhat a contrarian position. I do believe the discussion of free speech on campus is completely out of place. I do not say that because there haven't been legitimate episodes on campus that have raised issues of free speech for people. I myself have been victimized in this frenzy that besets our campuses across the country in recent years. But I think we have made a fundamental mistake. We've confused two terms that are not directly related. The one term is free speech. The other term is free inquiry. And I'm here to submit that what we are about on this and every campus is far more free inquiry than freedom of speech. To be sure, people do not shed their political rights when they walk onto a university campus. To be equally sure, they do not redefine the mission of the university by bringing their political rights with them. And our focus requires to be on the mission of the university. I published a piece a year and a half ago directly addressing the topic. Therefore, I'm not going to simply say something new about it. I'm going to repeat what I've already said. Indeed, what I'll do is simply read a brief passage from my essay, Qui Custodies Custodiet, published in August of 2017, in which I'm focused specifically on the question of how we got into this predicament. So bear with me, it's very brief. The significance of these observations in our present circumstances is to identify a need, the urgency of which is only intensified since Reagan first identified it, to recognize the culture-bearing function of higher education and to redirect it towards sustaining rather than undermining cultural health. To those who believe that the university's mission is not to reinforce but to challenge culture, I offer the observation I had made elsewhere, following Edward Shills: the universities have to a large extent supplanted the churches. Because this remark elaborated Alexis de Tocqueville's argument, it was necessary that I add that Tocqueville sought to convey by habits of mind a new and advanced understanding of terms of analysis central to our evolved political and moral universe. What this means for any analysis of higher education is that in order to be appropriate to the task, such an analysis must undertake to identify the broader responsibilities of higher education, including its moral responsibilities, and not merely the personal opportunities it affords to students. For habits of mind will constitute our most decisive collective possession. This, we believe, is the deeper meaning of Jacques Maritain's observation that the man of our civilization is the Christian man more or less secularized. The university, accordingly, ought to be the cultural watchman, but is standing athwart cultural reinforcement. How deep is the problem? Consider that the free speech protest in Berkeley over 50 years ago contested the authority of the university to govern the expressive conduct of students. In doing so, the protest movement directly challenged the university's central function to guide disciplined inquiry. In practice, that means the university should make judgments of relevance and value regarding presentations to students and the appropriateness of lending institutional facilities to such purposes. That is their job. To deny this duty, and it is a duty and not a right, is to deny the essential function of the university. Now, this is not meant to convey that any university should directly control, pardon that alarm, what students should say or do on their own dime. But we must remember that the People's Park protests originated in a seizure, they called it appropriation, of university property by the protesters. In that case, the defense of free speech was literally a justification for theft. Today, the heirs of New Left protesters actually govern the universities. In their turn, they seek to reestablish an absolute authority for university officials to govern expressive conduct in university programs and facilities. Do we not think that ironic? If so, we must think still more ironic the response of the present-day defenders of university authority, who have employed the free speech of counter-demonstrations in order to deny a Charles Murray or Ann Coulter or other target of political correctness the opportunity to appear on campuses across the United States. Science distinguishes between arguments of analysis and arguments of expression. The latter may well be the subjects of analysis and therefore properly presented in the context of higher education, but they have no claim to belong there other than as subjects of analysis. Defending them as free speech rather than as targets of analysis undercuts the work of definition, of distinguishing, which is at the heart of higher education. Finally, the problem is evident. The freedom of speech defense for blacklisting speakers on campus is out of place. The problem with such prohibitions is that they are wrong. It's not that they are wrong, that they fail the test of intellectual rigor or integrity, rather, not that they interfere with free speech. However, the defenders of the university's authority to permit or deny a platform stand on proper grounds, respecting university authority, even when they stand falsely concerning the objectives they expect to further by this particular exercise of authority. I conclude, therefore, we should not be talking about free speech or whether the campus is permitted. We should be talking about the quality of the judgments campus administrators are making.
Thank you, Dr. Al. Mr. Milhiser?
All right. So my time is short, so I'm going to try to whip through 5 points real quick. The first point is that there isn't a campus free speech crisis in any systemic way. There are certainly individual incidents that I'm sure we will hear about over the course of this panel, and many of those incidents, I think, involve people on campuses behaving very badly. But if you look at the data, so there's an organization that's actually, I mean, they are the leading organization pushing the narrative that there is some sort of crisis. They're called the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. And they keep a database of all of the incidents on American campuses where a speaker was shouted down or otherwise there was an attempt to exclude the speaker. And in 2008, their database shows 9 incidents, and only 5 were successful. And that's out of 4,700 campuses in the country. So you can certainly point to individual cases where some students have behaved badly, but this isn't a problem that's sweeping the nation. This is a story of anecdotes and not data. The second point is, of course, we're having this conversation in a much broader political context. And in that political context, as America becomes less racist and less sexist and less homophobic, one consequence of this, and I think this is a very positive thing, is that people who historically have felt like they could not express themselves or have historically felt that it was pointless for them to express their grievances now feel that they do have space to do so. And that is why you see women who historically have dealt with sexual innuendo or much worse from their male colleagues saying, stop it, in a way that wasn't the case maybe 40 years ago. It's why I think you see people of color on campus saying, look, like the canon of text that we read should not be written entirely by white men and selected entirely by white men. And I think it is appropriate and positive that people are having these conversations. But that brings me to my third point, which is that these conversations are hard. America has struggled with racism from the beginning. We've struggled with sexism less explicitly from the beginning. We've struggled with homophobia even less explicitly from the beginning. And I do not think it is fair to expect a campus full of 18 to 22-year-olds who are just coming into their adulthood to always get things right. They will do dumb things. That's what college is for. You know, college is for experimenting with new ideas, and when you're experimenting with new ideas, sometimes you're going to do something dumb. It's not the end of the world when it happens. And I will say one other point there. These conversations are hard. And as a white man, I have found myself on the receiving end many times of someone pointing out to me that something I said that never occurred to me might be offensive was in fact really troubling. It doesn't feel good when that happens, and it also doesn't mean I was right. And the fact that people who look like me have historically had the power to shut down those conversations does not mean that we should continue to do so. My fourth point is that no one has a right to a podium. This university, like every university, has limited resources. And that means that they can only bring so many speakers to campus, they can only have so many professors, and if a particular individual is excluded, that often isn't discrimination, it's just economics. And then my fifth point, which I'm going to state provocatively, and you're going to think probably that I'm making a very provocative point, but I hope when I explain myself, you will decide that I'm not, which is that there has to be a mechanism to screen terrible ideas out of the academy. And having stated that in the most provocative terms, let me explain what I mean by it. If you attended an American university 100 years ago, there was probably a department of eugenics. If you attended a law school 100 years ago, the constitutional law class would teach you that Jim Crow is perfectly legal and that minimum wage laws are unconstitutional. An anthropology class may very well teach you that colonialism has brought civilization to the benighted people of India and Africa. There might even be professors at the medical school who would teach you that smoking is good for your health. Now, I think that the threshold for when you say that a viewpoint no longer belongs in an academic dialogue is high. But there is a point where a political science department could say, no, we are not hiring you because you are a monarchist, or because you are a Stalinist, or because you are a fascist. And the process of inquiry has reached the conclusion that those viewpoints do not need to be excluded in a discussion of politics, or do not need to be included in a healthy discussion of politics. So those are my 5 points. I'm sure that this is going to get much more heated soon. So I will drink from my water bottle and look forward to what everyone else has to say.
Great, thank you very much. Dr. Collins?
Well, I'm probably not going to fulfill Ian's forecast, but anyway, in academia, we usually describe the policy not as free speech, but as academic freedom. That shifts the focus away from the First Amendment and makes it, includes private universities that are not subject to the First Amendment, as well as public universities. Of course, there's a lot of overlap, but academic freedom is a better caption for campus issues. There are 4 or 5 areas of natural conflict. The one that probably inspired this panel is battles over freedoms of controversial visiting speakers to hold forth that we've already been discussing, and those who want to hear them versus those who want to demonstrate against them. As is often the case, proper policy is a reasonable balance to give both invited speakers and opposing demonstrators a chance to be heard. That will involve some heckling, but not blocking a visitor's appearance. The worst case for sure is when the threats lead to the speaker staying home, and that has happened in a few instances. But my take on all of this from the perch of a teacher on this campus is that the issue is hugely overblown. Locally, we're known as a politically liberal campus and city, but in my 36 years on this campus, the number of outside speakers controversial enough to get angry notice in the press is in the single digits, and no one has been entirely excluded. The very conference we are in illustrates the record. Every year, it brings in an extremely broad range of speakers, and no one is shouted down. I realize it is otherwise at Cal Berkeley and a few other places, but, and I've got a different number than Ian does it, most of the nation's, my number is 5,300 campuses, have managed the balance well. The other conflict that might be close to the panel's charge involves claims that liberal faculty appoint liberals, perpetuating campus bias against conservatives, countered with moves by some wealthy donors to force more conservative appointments. Again, way, way overstated by focusing on particular faculties rather than all of them, and on a few controversial donors. Excessive emphasis extends to the President's March 21st executive order that provoked this panel. Its main subject is the high cost of tertiary education, which the order seeks to ease by greater transparency and accountability. I fully agree, that's an excellent goal. Less than 20% of the order concerns academic freedom, and it's a very vague statement. But 100% of the press reports about the order concern academic freedom. I do agree, of course, with the view that, such as the Wall Street Journal took, that the federal executive department is not the right place to be a judge of academic freedom, but there will be judicial review and congressional oversight, so I'm not that concerned about it. To me, now here comes, I have to say something provocative, don't I? Okay. To me, a much greater problem for campuses and for society is the proliferation of lying all around us. Of course, we've always had lying, but social media have exploded its influence. We have spectacles like Pizzagate, believed by millions, which inspired a young man to attack the pizza parlor to his personal ruin. Academic freedom champions often minimize this problem. The recent manifesto from the University of Chicago faculty, that I am sure is well known to my fellow panelists, proclaims that speech restrictions are subject only to, quote, narrow exceptions, unquote. But the exceptions for fraud and lying under oath are anything but narrow. Were that manifesto enforceable law, it would provide a defense to plagiarism, cheating on exams, false claims to authorship of submitted papers, fake data in research, and other frauds.
Thank you, Dr. Collins. Dr. Kaufman?
I disagree with everybody.
This is a good panel.
I agree with William Allen that the issue is freedom of inquiry, and I agree with you that it's academic freedom. And my response is that those things cannot occur without freedom of speech. Now, if a private university that doesn't accept federal money wants to run their shop any way they want, Hillsdale does it, they can do that. But if you take federal money, and this is how progressives have metastasized Title IX from its original purpose into an all-encompassing way of chilling legitimate as well as illegitimate action on campus, it is perfectly reasonable for the federal government to insist that if you want the taxpayers' money, you have to respect freedom of speech on campus. Now, this is a minor problem. Universities don't get it. A lot of the focus has been on the treatment of speakers coming into campus where there is certainly an invidious double standard, making it more difficult for conservative speakers, not on the fringe, but who have legitimate academic credentials. Alan Dershowitz is the Felix Frankfurter Professor Emeritus at Harvard University and a liberal. He encounters on a routine basis denial of the right to speak on campus on the issue of defending a decent democratic Israel. Is that the type of issue beyond the pale of legitimate debate? Or, much more seriously, academic hiring statistics, especially in elite universities, over 95% of faculty are identified as progressive, liberal, left. The entire university hiring and job definition process since the tenured radicals took over campuses in the late 60s, and it's become worse, except in the honorable exceptions of the fields of economics and the hard science, have increasingly made it difficult for conservative scholars even to pursue an academic career. If you talk to conservative students on campus, they will routinely tell you that they are afraid to come out as conservatives because, with many honorable exceptions, professors increasingly indoctrinate and tell you what to think rather than the original noble purpose of a university, how to think. The American Constitution considered intellectual freedom, and this is unique in the annals of any constitution, and it's something we should cherish, and we risk losing it given the current trajectory of universities. We considered academic freedom and free speech so important that in the Constitution, Article 1, even before the First Amendment, we protected the right of patent and intellectual property. We are losing that essence, not only of what a university should be, but ourselves, with the proliferation of speech codes, preferential hiring, chilling of legitimate debate, safe spaces, and we're not doing our students any service. If kids can't learn to hear a diverse range of ideas on a university campus, they're not going to fare very well in a rough and tumble world. And I want to give credit. People ask me, why do I come back to this madness for year 12? One, I like to torment people, and I'm good at it. But secondly, this campus, and I want to credit your wonderful, intrepid university president, Bruce Benson, Phil DiStefano, your provost, who is a liberal in the old-fashioned World War II sense of the word, where he is looking for excellence and freedom of inquiry, and your wonderful choice that I hope is ratified, your new president, Mark Kennedy, I hope, because this campus is unique. Your Center for Western Thought is committed to bringing in first-rate conservative academics to stimulate legitimate academic debate, and they give us a generous speaking budget to bring in people, not like Milo, but at the highest level. And if you don't think freedom of speech is a problem on campus related to freedom of inquiry, I suggest you research the case of Amy Wax at the University of Pennsylvania. I just hosted an event at Pepperdine. I moderated an event co-sponsored by the Steamboat Institute, where Alan Dershowitz, a liberal, a lawyer with few rivals in terms of his credibility, and Amy Wax, who is a victim of political correctness, she published 2 articles that express positions that mainstream authors have expressed with respectable credentials. What happened to Amy Wax? 33 members of her faculty not only disagreed with her, that's legitimate, they signed a petition to have her fired. The dean, and I exclude this campus, but many deans have the backbone of a chocolate eclair that's been microwaved on high for 10 minutes. The dean proceeded to remove her from teaching any first-year law students. And I've been on campuses 46 years, and things, until Donald Trump, have gone from bad to worse. Yes, using an executive order is a crude response. But what Donald Trump's election signifies, however much you may disagree with the mode of how he expresses things, is a very healthy rebellion against the stifling political correctness that people have taken for granted as being acceptable as people seethed in sullen silence. Trump has done three very valuable things. One of the worst things that Obama did, and there are so many, it's quite a contest, is to lower the burden of proof on Title IX. So instead of clear and convincing evidence or beyond a reasonable doubt, it's quote unquote preponderance of the evidence, 50% plus one, which given the dynamics of these inquiries means you're guilty until proven innocent. That's a violation of the American way and chilling of speech. Secondly, God bless him, Donald Trump's administration has filed an amicus curiae brief against Harvard University for their invidious Asian quota that runs against the promise of the Declaration of Independence, undermines excellence, and is a replication of the pernicious Jewish quota of the 1930s. Thirdly, although it's symbolic, President Trump, when you say, oh, only 20% of this dealt with free speech, Donald Trump at CPAC specifically made the point that he was going to do this because he believed, after a conservative got punched at Berkeley, that it was time for the federal government to make sure that if you're going to get federal money, you have to permit freedom of speech on campus, without which, even though there's a theoretical distinction, you need freedom of inquiry. And I don't think Donald Trump's finished on this, and I'm glad he isn't, because I predict that Donald Trump is going to use this scandal over buying admissions to force universities that have been insulated from scrutiny while they've taken federal money from many people who have less money than the people who are running universities, to open up their admissions process, because if you think that buying your way in is the only side door, I think you're sadly mistaken. So even if Donald Trump is rough, tough, and a brawler, I'm going to quote the great Victor Davis Hanson, one of our national treasures. Donald Trump's like chemotherapy. You don't want it. It has bad side effects. It's ugly, but it's necessary, and I think Donald Trump is a healthy antibody to the stifling political correctness where universities have moved away from their noble purpose to the detriment of their students, to the detriment of free inquiry, and the detriment of this country. On this issue, not one, not two, but three cheers for Donald James Trump. Thank you.
Dr. Cox.
Can I jump in for just a quick sec?
Okay, and then I do want to bring you guys back to the subject
Sure.
of free speech on campus, because there were a lot of paths that you went down there weren't exactly free speech on campus.
Sure. So
Okay.
I just want to, because you mentioned Amy Wax, I think it would be useful if the audience knew what the facts are of the situation that we're talking about here. So Amy Wax is a law professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and she was on video, said that she does not know of a case where an African-American student graduated in the top quarter of the class at Penn, and that black students are rarely in the top half. Now, as an empirical matter, that is false. And we know it is false because after there were calls for her
Hold on a minute.
to be...
Ian, it's not an empirical matter that the statement that she does not know is false. So you must not be sloppy in this. You may say she didn't know the truth, but you can't say it's empirically false that she did not know.
Well, so what I do know is she made an incorrect assertion.
Don't say it's
She
empirically
asserted
false.
that she... No, it is empirically
Not
false.
that she didn't
And the
know.
reason I do not know
The
if she
empirical
was...
standard is whether she knew or not. That's the empirical test. He is not telling the truth about that test, even if he's telling the truth about the facts.
Okay, let me restate the point again, and we'll try
State
it.
it correctly.
She claimed, she stated
No, she said she did not
that
know.
that she does not know of a black student who
Thank
has
you.
ever graduated in the top
You must
quarter.
prove that she
and
did know. Now you must
Will you
prove that
please
she
let me
did know.
finish?
All right,
No,
let's let
interrupted
Ian
that.
make his point. Let's make his.
Yeah.
This is an interjection.
Okay, so she
Let him
made the
finish the
statement that
sentence,
I
then
have
make
now
the interjection.
repeated 3 times. You can interpret it however you want to interpret it.
I want you to be exact, that's all.
And the reason we know that her statement was not empirically accurate is because the dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School has access to racialized data showing how many black students graduate in which quarter of the class, and was able to confirm that, as a matter of fact, her statement was not empirically correct. The sanction that the university imposed on her was not to strip her of her teaching responsibilities, nor was it to strip her of tenure, nor was it to strip her of her salary. The sanction that they imposed upon her was to say that she could no longer teach first-year classes. And the reason they imposed that particular sanction on her is that in law school, second and third year classes are electives, but your first year classes, you show up and you are assigned to a class. And they felt correctly, in my view, that a black student would not be comfortable being randomly assigned to the classroom of a professor who made those comments. Now, those are what happened in the Amy Wax incident. You can agree with the University of Pennsylvania's decision to impose that particular sanction on her, or you can disagree with the University of Pennsylvania's
Well, you know,
decision.
you omitted several things based on, as your usual, your authoritative claim on what the facts were. One, the University of Pennsylvania's dean claimed that, but never released the data. So don't tell me, and don't tell this audience, that it is proven false.
So you think
That
there's
is
a
the- that is
conspiracy
the-
where the dean manufactured
The dean
data in
did
order to
not
justify
release-
removing a professor?
The dean did not release that information. Yes or no? Secondly, the point that Amy Wax made about the underclass that inadvertently preferential treatment creates is not a point that has not been made by very serious people. Stuart Taylor, the National Law Journal, and the person who has made this case much more forcefully than anybody else, and anybody who doesn't think that he is one of the great public intellectuals and economists doesn't know anything, is Tom Sowell, who has made this case relentlessly for a number of years. Now, I understand that if the University of Pennsylvania faculty wants to disagree with Amy Wax, that's great. That's what legitimate inquiry is. If the dean wants to disagree with Amy Wax, one, release the data, and two, the original effort on Amy Wax was to quote unquote encourage her with a strong arm to take an extended leave of absence. I just spent 3 days with Amy Wax. Now, in terms of being chilling of speech, how do you think the effect of a young lost professor who may be on the conservative side, what do you think the effect of that, the signal of that if you express something that other academics of high rank have expressed, even if you disagree with it, this is what's going to happen to you. And one more point.
Gentlemen,
It's much harder to be hired as a conservative on campus than a Stalinist.
Gentlemen, I would
by
like to bring
far.
us back to the issue at hand, and rather than debate a specific case at the University of Pennsylvania. And we have a question here I'd like to bring forward to you that I think is relevant to free speech on campus, which is, when does speech become hate speech? And should hate speech be allowed? That is a constant thing that all campuses are faced with when they have students or faculty or staff that disagree with the speaker they're being brought on. I often get emails saying that person is all about hate speech, the university should be barring them. So I'd like to talk about, how do you adjudicate what hate speech is as a start, please? Who would like to take that one?
I'll start, and I think there should be almost, not quite, an irrebuttable presumption against restricting speech on campus. Because the danger
Unless
of,
it's to cheat.
because the danger of restricting speech for the university mission of free, and also this has been selectively applied as well. So when in doubt, this is my strong presumption, free speech should win out, and
What is the legal standard for hate speech?
Hate speech is not, it's illegal in many other nations. It's not legal in this country because the First Amendment prevents it from being legal. It's in any legal contest about the lawfulness of suppressing something in the name of hate speech. Now, the problem in part is that there are related situations of harassment and things of that kind where harassment can be restrained, but just using what we call hate speech cannot be forbidden.
Look, I've been the victim of hate speech on campus. I've had swastikas on my door. I have had one university professor at the University of Vermont with the brain of a small squirrel accuse me of being a Nazi, even though A, I was the protege of the founder of Holocaust Studies, Raoul Hilberg, and B, it is metaphysically impossible for me to be a Nazi because I'm not eligible for membership, regardless of
And
my
I'd like
preference.
to allow Dr. Allen to jump in here for a minute.
I will just say one quick word before I have to leave. The problem of hate speech, much like the problem of hate crime, is not simply a question of definition. For we must understand that it's not the speech that is punished in hate speech, but the motive. And the one thing to which we do not have access in any human being is motive. I grant you that our whole legal system is constructed on the premise that we can determine such things as intentional murder. We ascribe motive, and we use elaborate procedures to discover whether something is premeditated, the motive. But in fact, motives are virtually inaccessible to us. The philosopher Montesquieu, in the 12th book of the Spirit of the Laws, which gives us the separation of powers, explained that anyone who begins to punish motives begins to establish tyranny. The first essay in the Federalist Papers, written by Alexander Hamilton, explains at great length that we cannot judge a proposition based on the motives. We must reason about the proposition itself to come to an answer about its appropriateness. So while there is an extended discourse about hate speech, and many people who assume they know what they're talking about, most of that is logically fallacious. Most of it represents a complete absence of rigor of thought in applying the term. And therefore, the task facing us is not to try to figure out where to apply hate speech appropriately, but to force the people who use those terms to think much more consistently and rigorously than they have shown any evidence of being able to do to this point. I'm sorry I have to say that and leave, but I got to get across campus.
Thank you
All
for
right.
joining us. Mr. Milhiser, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I want to jump off of your point, Richard, about I think that to analyze this in terms of hate speech is probably not a useful way of coming up with a rule that can work in this space, and it makes more sense to think of it in terms of concepts like harassment, which are familiar in the workplace, and that we have legal standards that we can apply there. So let's, for a second, take hate speech out of it. Imagine that you had a professor who was just a jerk. And this professor calls all of his students moron. Or this professor selectively calls certain students that he doesn't like moron. That professor would not be doing his job well or her job well because that professor is not fostering an environment in the classroom where education can reasonably be expected to take place. And it would be appropriate for a university to sanction that professor for behaving in that way. So now imagine a different professor. And this different professor is creating an equally hostile environment for some students. And the only difference for this professor is that rather than calling students a term that is non-racial, this student is using racialized language to create a hostile environment for their students. Or this student is targeting certain students and calling them morons because they are black or because they have some other identity. I do not see why we would analyze these two cases differently. It seems to me that if the job of the institution is to foster a healthy educational environment, then if a professor is not capable of doing that, then professor is perhaps not the appropriate job for them. And that's, and the question of whether they're fostering that hostile environment along identitarian terms or other terms, I don't think is really relevant to the inquiry.
Although public universities are required to enforce discrimination law. And so, depending on how far that goes, that may enter that field.
Which is all the more the reason why that professor shouldn't be in the classroom.
What I would offer as an administrator in this case of that when we get notices about hate speech, and I speak with our university council, there is very little legal definition, which I believe Dr. Collins was addressing, to hate speech. There are a lot of us who want to say that's hate speech because we don't like that particular version, but very rarely does anything fall into a category where we can exclude it from campus on some legal basis. It doesn't exist for us.
But part of it is also burden of proof, and I'm very happy to say that our current university president, Bruce Benson, is foursquare with me in arguing that the standards for these things be moved from the current or the Obama preponderance of the evidence that puts the burden on the speaker.
But that's Title IX for sexual assault and those kinds of things, not the judgment of free speech on campus.
Oh, well, but that's not actually true if you look at the Title IX language that defines harassment based on political affiliation, political point of
which
view.
goes to the discrimination law that we have
Yes,
to
but
uphold.
that also is an area where President Benson considers that chilling of speech and wants to move back to a more traditional presumption of innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So even at this university,
Bob,
that's
we
very
don't
helpful.
have a code to which we don't have a speech code on this campus. I don't know what you're talking about.
Title IX has been used as a speech code everywhere, including on this campus.
So if
Take it from someone who knows.
If I could jump in just real quick to translate some lawyer into English here. So Bob keeps using this phrase preponderance of the evidence, and to explain what that means, so taking aside the issue of what happens on campus, if you file a lawsuit, you will have a burden of proof in order to win that lawsuit. And your burden of proof typically depends upon, or if you're in court for any reason, you have a burden of proof you have to meet. And the burden of proof generally depends upon the type of suit and the entity bringing that suit. So in criminal suits, the standard is that the prosecution has to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And the reason that is the highest standard that is recognized by the law, and the reason why we apply the highest standard in that case is because the government has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, and if the government is going to use its sovereign power against someone, we want to be really, really sure before they bring such awesome and incontestable power against someone. Most lawsuits, on the other hand, if you just file a civil suit against someone, are dealt with under a preponderance standard.
No, it's
And
clear and convincing, not preponderance.
No, that is not true. I'm sorry, that's just inaccurate.
And
in
before
most
Obama,
lawsuits,
it
the
was clear
standard.
and convincing on Title IX. Go look at it, 2000.
Dr. Collins, you want to break that
I'm very familiar
tie?
with what the regulations say. We're
Let's let
talking
the-
about civil suits. And in civil suits, I am 100% confident that in the overwhelming majority of civil suits, the standard is a preponderance of the evidence, which is
On
about
this area.
50% plus one.
Dr. Collins
Now,
might
Bob
be able
is
to break
correct
that tie, gentlemen.
that Bob is correct that there are some unusual cases where a higher standard applies, clear and convincing evidence. But in the overwhelming, in the mind run of lawsuits, it's a preponderance of the evidence. And the only reason I bring that up is because the things that you can be forced to do under a preponderance standard are very, very high. Someone could sue you for $500 million and win their suit if they prove their case by a preponderance of the evidence. Someone could bring a suit that will shut down your business and will win their case if they can prove their case by a preponderance of the evidence. So, I mean, I think there's a very robust debate about which standard should apply in the sort of quasi-criminal context where someone is accused of where someone is accused of committing what would be a very serious crime, but not by a prosecutor.
So I'm going to bring us back to free speech, if I may. And I would like to bring a question from a student, because students do get a preference on our questions. As a student, I have never had a professor express their liberal views. If they are liberal, actually the professors have told us they cannot express their views as the university upper management will not let them. Is that right? I'm going to turn that over to Dr. Collins.
I didn't catch all the question, I'm sorry.
So the student says that he or she has never had a professor express liberal views in the classroom, I think in response to some of the things that have been said here, and that she or he has been told that the professors cannot express their personal views by the university administration. Is that correct?
No, it's not correct, but I mean, I go out of my way not to express political views in the classroom, and I think most of my colleagues do. I know of one or two exceptions. There's certainly no enforced policy about forbidding it. We just think it's the prudent thing to do. It's a way to teach people to think for themselves rather than try to impose a viewpoint on them. So.
That's the way it's supposed to be, and I'm sure many people honor that, but many people don't. Just for the record, in over 30 years of teaching evaluations, where people have had many legitimate complaints about me that I'd agree with, I've never had one student in thousands complain that they ever received a grade based on their political convictions whatsoever. And I wish it were so that this were the exception rather than the rule. But I don't agree with that, and I don't think the data supports it, and I also think that the data shows that there's a double standard. Let me give you an example from my university, Pepperdine. After Donald Trump won the election, a professor whose field was not politics decided to have a grieving session and not have class and turn the lights out and mourn. Now, one, that is an abuse of the position. But two, I was not radiating with joy the day after Obama won. But let's suppose I did the same thing. You think those two cases would have been treated equally? And if you do, I think you're 420 friendly. And I think that describes the problem on campus in a nutshell. I don't think that professors should be in the business of doing this, one. But to the extent they do, they should be judged by the categorical imperative rather than a standard that seems to be applied selectively more severely to one side or the other.
So I'm going to go back to another student question. Since Trump was elected, there is discussion about how hate speech has risen. What do you think campuses need to do to not overstep free speech yet protect those from hate speech? It's right back in that hate speech versus free speech nexus.
Well, the answer of our legal culture is to answer bad speech with good speech.
Yep.
So that if improper speech of any sort is used, the answer is to, the solution is to answer it with correct speech, not with punishment. And that's the gist of the First Amendment. That's what it's all about.
Any other thoughts on that? Or
Yeah,
do I move on?
and I agree with you, and the emblematic speech is, emblematic case is the Skokie case in 1996, and I have relatives who lived there. Many of them were sons and daughters of Holocaust victims, and the Supreme Court nevertheless said, rightly, not approving of it in any way, that neo-Nazis had a right to march through Skokie because the value of free expression, excuse my verb, trumps the legitimate concern of the people, because when in doubt, the cost of regulating speech in the long run will cost more than permitting it. And I agree with you, and I think the United States has answered that correctly. The way to combat this is not to chill speech, but to answer bad speech with reasonable debate.
Well, I'm going to
So-
go back to something Mr. Milhiser said earlier, and maybe this is where you're going.
This is probably where I'm going.
You had talked about it's up to universities to decide how to use their limited resources.
Yes.
So, and there have been some court cases, as you're probably aware, directly on this, particularly as relates to Berkeley, and, you know, charging more for, if you're a very controversial speaker and you're going to bring a lot of protesters with you, I'm going to charge you more for security. And court cases have said basically, no, you can't do that. You can charge the normal cost of security, but anything you need to do beyond that, because you need to, back to the student's comment, protect your community, falls on the resources of the university. And I'd be interested in having you kick that off.
So I'll make 3 points, like just to address the prior question. I largely agree that you don't want to have campuses in the business of censoring speech. I think that at the extreme end, you know, if you had a student who ran around campus screaming racial slurs, then that student could properly be excluded from the campus. You know, for the same reason that if I create a racially harassing environment in a workplace, then my employer has an obligation to fire me if they do not wish to be sued. But, you know, I agree that in the mine run of cases that, you know, free speech should be the norm. So 2 thoughts real quick about what you have going on some of these campuses. So if you're a student and you're inclined to throw a big protest or shout down some speaker because they believe stupid things, please don't. Please don't. And here's why you shouldn't do it. It's not because that speaker has anything valuable to say. It's because a lot of these speakers are professional trolls. And the thing that they want most in the world is for someone to throw a big tantrum, and then they get to whine about how they're being censored, and then they get invited to 900 other campuses by campus conservative groups that hope there will be another tantrum. So please don't do that. It's not an effective tactic. It is a counterproductive tactic. Don't do it. But that said, I don't think that when those incidents arise, when a professional troll is brought to campus and students, or in some cases it's not even students, sometimes it's just locals who come to the campus and make a scene, that we should put 100% of the blame on the unstrategic students. You're talking here about people whose business model is to try to rile people up so that they get free advertising for the fact that they that they have
tweets.
And I don't necessarily want to assign I'm not going to get into the legal analysis of whether someone can be excluded under those circumstances, but I think morally a professional troll deserves just as much blame, if not more, for causing people to do exactly what they were hoping that they were going to do.
So your answer is have the community not go to and ignore and not get riled up about speakers they don't like.
Yeah, the best thing that you can do to Milo is pay him no attention at all. If we could all just close our eyes and forget he exists, it would be a much better world for everyone on the planet except for Milo.
Well, to put this resource question into perspective, one of the ancient issues about academic freedom is the conflict between the freedom of a professor to research or teach what he or she pleases and the efficient delivery of good teaching and good research by the university. Now, in extreme cases, professors go off the rails. Holocaust deniers are a sort of standard example. But most of the time, professors should be allowed to research what they want and say what they want because it generally produces better outcomes for everyone. But there are, that's the problem with these anecdotes. The anecdotes are just that. They're isolated cases in many instances, and they get blown out of proportion. I am pleased to hear that our university is much better than others. I hadn't known that before. I thought we were just a typical state university.
Hey.
But thank you, Bob.
No, you're not. Charles Murray's not a troll. And read the terrible experience he had at Middlebury, and his defender at Middlebury was not a conservative, a friend, colleague I taught for many years with Allison Stenger, he's not a troll. Michael Oren, the award-winning historian, paratrooper, former Israeli ambassador, who was shouted down at Cal Irvine, a classmate of mine, Mike Bornstein then, is not a troll. So one of the problems that I want to make a distinction about is not thinking of speakers on campus. And when I was here and the conservative scholars here, we didn't want to bring the Milos in for the same reason that you don't want to bring provocative speakers here, because we wanted to bring the best, most credible academics, not to discredit
I think you and Mr.
conservatism.
Milhiser are agreeing.
We do agree on this.
I'm shocked.
I
we
might have
do.
some differing views on Charles Murray, but we
Yeah.
can move on.
Well, a troll he's not.
Okay, well, not on everything.
But you know, see, I think that's the problem.
Right.
That, you know, we talk in the abstract that, yes, only trolls. But if we get down to
Okay,
the
well-
nitty-gritty, I think you and I are going to debate about
I'm
who the
happy to
troll
talk
is.
about Charles Murray if you want. So Charles Murray, I think, is a marginal case.
And unfortunately, we're at time.
Oh.
We are at time, and I want to thank everyone for coming, but I do say that I think this panel has agreed that this is a difficult topic, and one of the key things is to have balanced representation of speakers coming in and people allowing that discourse to happen. And that's one of the things we're trying to achieve, and I'm really pleased that the panel could address that. It's obviously leads in a lot of places, but please help me thank them for being with us. Although I would have loved to have heard that, Ian.
Yeah. I mean, like, the thing about Charles Murray is that he's written so many books, and some of them are genuine works of scholarship, and
Right.
some of them are atrocious works of trolling.